It was not on air. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Los Angeles Java User Group. This is the November 2014 edition. Tonight's topic is modern unit testing techniques. And some of you might find the techniques very old because they're based on techniques that have been established for at least 14 years, if not longer, on the Java platform. And some incorporating some new things that I think every developer should know. Before I start the presentation, are there any announcements to be made?
Well, I remember the program. So I'm from Mobile Forming. We're a mobile app company. We build apps for different things with apps. We are looking for a visual engineer, Java engineer, 2 to 3 years of experience to work on the backend services.
Okay, any other announcements?
OC Jeopardy coming out 13th. You feel like making a trip down there. It's going to be Agile related, creating hyper-productive teams. So we're on the
So can we ask some of those speakers to maybe speak here? Can we?
I can. I just haven't. I've been trying to.
Actually, Ray said, ask Marco if he'll come down and speak to us.
You guys have been dormant for a while, too.
Huh?
You guys have been dormant for a while.
OCJ.
No, they haven't. Santa Monica.
In a year.
Dave Ford is the guy running, right?
No. Ray Tech has been running it. I've been helping out, scheduling meetings for last year.
The past. I've been saying this like a broken record, but the past year, it's been more and more challenging to find audience and speakers. At least that's how I feel about it.
To find speakers?
And audience. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Both.
Meetup has helped us a lot.
I think it's actually hurt us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I never see, you have a link to the meetup thing, but I don't know. It's definitely helped people find us. I try to make sure that our meetings scheduled on there at least a month in advance so that we come up. Basically, the way meetup searches work is that if you don't have a meetup scheduled, and there's like 2 ways to search for a group and search for a meetup. If you don't have a meetup scheduled, you will not show up. You can search for Java, but if you had clicked for some reason the meetup thing, LA Java won't show up in the search. You have to schedule a meeting. So that's why some people will be like, topic TBD, but we'll definitely meeting.
I see.
And like I'll set up an announcement usually, even if it's just a topic and I don't know when or where we're going to meet, and then we'll still get a number of the core user number of people will sign up.
How would you guys feel if I make next month social instead? I'm thinking of doing that, but I don't know if anybody would be interested in that. No? Keep it technical.
We've done that a couple times when we couldn't find a speaker. So the turnout is basically just the 5 guys who show up for dinner. Anyway.
So I shouldn't do that.
I'm just saying it's typically pretty low.
How about a small presentation and then social? It's not a bad idea, right? Because this presentation, I mean, I could drag it out, but it could be pretty quick too. So, okay, I'll keep that in mind then. Any other announcements?
Just have one question regarding the procedure. You guys had a speaker talking about the Spark. Can we have that speaker coming here?
Spark. No, we didn't have one.
Spark or Splunk?
Okay, that last time.
We talked about Spark. That's LA Big Data. LA Big Data user group. There's LA Hadoop user group. There's 2 of them, and there's a guy, Subhash D'Souza, who's been working these things. If you're interested in big data, I would join those groups just to get his weekly. He's got his big data musings, and it's like a collection of links of like important articles that happened in the last week. And it's all he's even linked to our OCJ. So he's doing a really great job.
I learned from that, actually.
Yeah, he's because it's hot topic or whatever, and it's LA.
Oh, how did you get?
I've seen 150 people show up for some of the big ones.
So I should search an income for what? Big data?
It's big data. Yeah.
What's his name?
Subhash. Yeah, LA big data user group, and there's also LA Hadoop user group, and there's a whole bunch of stuff on LA data science. So if for people doing R, there's another guy, Zilar, who's been doing stuff for R and Python and all the data science. But I go to some of those things, but it really is, I mean, I met some cool people, but they got like PhDs in statistics. And they'll be rattling off all these like statistical.
Okay. What is on the broadcast? I want to thank HopePods for letting us have our meeting here, and Filter for buying us snacks, and myself for you guys for buying pizza for you guys as well, and for coming up with the presentation. Okay, I don't have any other announcements, so I'm going to proceed. So you share screen, entire screen, share, and then this part gets kind of weird, right? Okay. Present. All right. So when I wrote the slides, I called useful practices in unit testing because I wasn't quite sure how modern my techniques were. I really am not. A lot of it is based on my techniques and what I found useful in my workplace. As an application developer, when I'm wearing that hat, I am expected to write unit tests for my work. Usually, application developers also work with a QA team to make sure that they usually focus on functional testing. But all right, let me proceed. GLA comments. All right, I'm starting off with the economics of software testing. I mean, these numbers are kind of pulled out of the hat. I'm sure they're actually higher than this. But needless to say, the sooner you detect the actual defect, the less it's going to cost the company. I'm sure it costs more than $1 to fix in requirement space, but the point is, it's about tenfold for each level of where the test date or the defect happens to be fixed. I heard the same thing when I was in university as well, and I pulled this particular statistic off of Wikipedia, actually. And the odd thing about it is they didn't tell you how much it costs in production. But I mean, imagine when Apple releases iOS and there's a bug. How much does that actually cost them? I'm sure it's a lot more than 10,000 for them. And they probably have to work 24/7 to fix it once that happens. I think iOS 8 had a bug when it came out. Hello?
All right.
Oh, by the way, feel free to interrupt me, interject anytime. I'll let you know.
This, travel user.
No, I know. Okay, thank you.
Now, I'm not going to cover all of these types of testing, but, and I made this graphic. It's the different types of software testing available. We're going to focus on the blue ones, which are unit testing, which is typically a form of white box testing. But I also should have highlighted that unit testing, since it's written as code and can be run anytime, is quite often a form of regression testing as well. If you refactor your code and you run the test case, well, isn't that a regression test, so to speak? So it is sort of used for that, but there's all sorts of types of testing that so I'm also going to touch a little bit of static testing, since that's quite simple to set up in a lot of shops.
Where did you get this graph? This is the
I made this graph.
Oh, you made it nice. That's nice. I've never seen this.
Actually, these are supposed, the red nodes are all supposed to be on the left-hand side. but it wouldn't fit in the slide. So instead I highlighted them and I grouped them. That way they could all fit on one slide. This is actually called a brain map. And it's easy to make these type of graphs with
I see the term smoke testing. I've seen that used, and I don't know what that means. What are smoke tests?
Smoke testing is turn it on, and it's literally from the old school electronics where you would plug it in and see if any smoke came out of it. So it might be, all right, like I start up my thing and it runs through the bootstrap process, and does any errors on the console or anything break just by turning it on?
It's just it's still before integration testing.
turn it on. Does it seem to work?
Okay.
And maybe, I guess in today's world, some of the most basic use cases of the system will be executed, but nothing very thorough. Any other questions on the? I don't know all of the answers for these, by the way. So I'm glad you pitched in. I would have had to look it up, and then I realized, oh yeah, that's right. I heard sanity testing quite a bit, and it's somewhat similar. Functional testing, that's you're not necessarily testing the code at a unit level, but more like a user's functionality, like, hey, how do I delete a file? Something like that. Non-functional testing is testing things like performance. It's not the functionality, but some other metric. And I'll move on to the next slide.
Destructive as in like failure testing.
You know
Use
what?
the load until something breaks.
I really don't know how to explain that one. Actually, I got all these different types of testing when I looked at Wikipedia, and I just typed in software testing. It listed all of them.
Yeah, I don't see load testing there.
Performance testing. Performance testing is kind of.
Yeah, all right.
Yeah.
That's a cute slide, isn't it? But we're gonna focus more on unit testing. This is the typical Wikipedia definition of it. A software testing method by which individual source code sets of one or more computer program modules together with associated control data, usage procedures, and operating procedures are tested to determine if they are fit for use. Well, in the Java world, that typically means testing if a method does what it's supposed to do. Just a single method, and usually it's small methods. And this next slide will explain something really important that I was about to say right now. A unit test is not an integration test. If your test cases make actual database calls, web service calls, or any external system, you are leaving the boundaries of what's referred to as a unit test because you're integrating outside components into your test, and that becomes an integration test. It used to be very difficult to manage that 14 years ago, but technology has making tests that are not integration tests very easy to do. This is what a basic unit test looks like in Java using JUnit. TestNG isn't that different. You annotate, you have a section of your code devoted just to unit test, and you annotate a method. You determine what your expected outcomes are. You make a call, get the actual result, and then assert whether the values that I expect are going to happen. So let's say you're doing a unit test for math absolute. Well, you know that if you get the absolute value of -1, then the result should be 1. You do an assertion on that, and when you run it through maybe your IDE or through Maven, the build will fail, or the IDE will tell you this unit test failed. But that's a basic unit test. All right, we're done. You can go home now. Just kidding. Unit tests are, go ahead.
Does it really include Java 8 or not?
Hmm?
Because Java 8 has lots of functional program features. So does the lecture include those features? About the testing, I know this is a testing lecture.
Right, there.
Because when you write this programming functional way, it's going to be different way than imperative. So do you have any suggestion, or are you talking how we can do the testing that way or not?
I didn't even think about writing a unit test for a functional program in that manner.
I'm talking about Java 8.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. I'm not a novice.
No.
But that said, if you are going to write a unit test for a functional like program, you're going to focus on the smallest possible units of it. You might not get to the point of actually calling a function with it. Maybe you will, but it might not be necessary. Could be. You always, when you are writing unit tests, you got to start with the smallest part first, and then work your way up.
But you cannot do the system out easily that we used to do, because
You're not supposed to use system out for a unit test. You write an assertion, and you check that the value is what you expect it to be. But you're supposed to start with the smallest units first. So for let's say a functional program, you would start with that one interface, that one function that you write, rather than handing it to some collection or stream and seeing what the results are after everything. You don't need to test at that level when you do unit testing. But no, I don't cover specific how to unit test the new features of JDK8. I don't do that in this presentation, sorry. So unit testing in the real world, I want to say that it could be very complex, and that's what this graph is intended to convey. The reason I say that is because quite often I underestimate how long it takes to complete a feature, because I always underestimate how long it takes to write test cases for it. In a lot of organizations, delivering code without thoroughly testing it is unacceptable and not considered complete. You write something, you tell people, I finished. If you didn't test it yet, you're not really done yet, because there are gonna, in complex software or non-trivial software or typical software, there are gonna be bugs in the stuff that you write. Everybody agrees with that, I'm sure. I see people nodding their heads. So unit testing can be quite complex, and it could often be more complicated than the actual system that you wrote. That's really frustrating sometimes. Have you guys had the same experience at times?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Sometimes testing is much more complex than the code itself.
Quite often, yes.
One of the things I noticed, and somebody else more similarly, is that in an MVC, typical MVC app, that there's so much little, code in the controller, so it keeps the controllers lightweight. I'm like, why do we care about keeping controllers lightweight? The reason we care is because testing controllers is such a pain in most frameworks. That it's just easier to test if you separate it out into either domain classes or into services.
Right.
One thing I've learned is when you start to design, you better have testing in mind, because that definitely affects how the whole thing is shaped up. Testing definitely should be one of the considerations when you actually start building things, because that definitely affects the final shape.
What makes unit testing complex? Well, this is my opinion, but usually it's an integration point, or it should be, I should say. It should be an integration point. If it's not that, quite often it's an untestable design, and there is ways to write code that makes it untestable. So I'll touch on a bit on how to make code more testable. All right, I already wrote it right here. How to write testable software. I'll just go step by step here. Well, as I said, one of the things that makes code hard to test is when you have a lot of integration points in it, and you have a method and does a web service call. I mean, if you're writing a unit test for what is it called? Something like Mule. What is it called for an ESB? Oh man, that's really hard because you have a lot of integration points in an ESB. But to write testable software, you need to isolate your boundary conditions and encapsulate them. I found a design pattern that specifically talks about this called the gateway design pattern. It is from the Gang of Four, and I'll elaborate on that in the next slide. And in your code, you got to separate decision making from actually doing pieces of work. Favor small methods, and occasionally, although it's not necessary these days, make methods visible for testing. Now, I'll elaborate on what that means. Quite often when you write a test case, a unit test, you're writing it for, you write your test case in the same package, but in the test directory of the class that you're testing. And in that situation, if you make the method package friendly, meaning there's no modifiers in front of it, well, your test case has access to that method. And Google, in their Guava API, even has a special annotation visible for testing. So people don't go, why did this guy make this method package friendly? He should have made it private. Well, you want to test it, that's why. But if you are writing software that absolutely must make a method private, there's ways around that for unit testing. So that kind of makes you think that code isn't that secure these days, huh? Maybe it isn't, because there is ways around it. And I'll elaborate on that later on. I'm sure there's ways to secure it too, but I'm just saying.
Or are you going to get into that?
Well, I think I'll try to explain it later, because I think it might be easier once I go to the next slide.
I think that works with number one, right? 3 is.
I mean, 1 and 3 are very strongly related.
Yeah. So when you do, you end up with boundary conditions. Well, if you're just doing the deciding, you can stay all open.
All right, gateway design pattern. The point of it is, I mean, you can read that, or if you want me to read it out loud, I will. But the point of it is that you wrap all special API code into a class whose interface looks like a regular object. Well, maybe I should read it out loud so that it's a little more clear. Software rarely lives in isolation. Even the purest object-oriented system often has to deal with things that aren't objects, such as relational database tables. When accessing these external resources like this, you'll usually get an API for them. However, these APIs are naturally going to be somewhat complicated. The answer is so common that it's hardly worth stating. Wrap all these special API code into a class whose interface looks like a regular object. Other objects access the resource through this gateway, which translates into simple method calls into the appropriate specialized API. See, these are meant to wrap your boundaries of your application where you're going to interface with an external system. And the reason that you want to separate deciding from doing is when you are writing your test cases, you're going to have to branch out and cover those decisions if you're using code coverage and you want to thoroughly test a method. If you have a method that handles all these different cases within a boundary, well, then it's really challenging to tell if it's doing the right thing. So that's why they try to encourage the gateways to do something rather than make the decision to do it.
Okay, can you just give us an example of this gateway? Like, let's say interact with the database. So you mean I should wrap the database interaction into a separate object and then they use that object?
Let me try to think of an example. So let's say you have a method that is supposed to, I don't know, deactivate certain users when they haven't used the system in X days, right? And of course, there's going to be a query to find out when was the last time the person used it, and another query to update and deactivate it, right? So those are two calls. One way to write it is to not, I mean, there will still be two database calls, but so the fact that there's two calls are going to be two separate methods, that's something being done, but that's not the decision to do it, right? So your unit test is going to be able to, let's say, mock or stub that in this situation, he's supposed to be deactivated. So did the deactivation call actually happen? So it's separating the doing from the deciding. I don't know if that.
That's correct, except that in the gateway design pattern means that I should really now have two database interactions. They have to be manifested as two, let's say, interface functions that are going
It would be, in this case, it'll be a data access object, right?
correct. It's going to be a data access.
And the service will be tested. But the data access object, the service is being unit tested. And the data access object is the gateway.
Correct. So
And-
data access object is really abstracting the database and it's really implementing this gateway design pattern.
Correct. And it's supposed to do something, and your service is making decisions as to what to do
Correct.
based on the data.
Exactly. That way you separate doing from decision making.
And when you write code like that, it's easier to test.
Correct.
And I'll elaborate on why later on. Now, here I touched on how to write testable software, but here I'm gonna write how I would test testable software. As we were just discussing, most likely I would use something like JUnit or TestNG. But a gateway, like a data access object, will be mocked with Mockito, PowerMock, or other alternatives. There are other mocking frameworks,
Easy one.
or EasyMock, yeah. As I was telling our new attendee earlier, you write test cases from the small methods first to the large ones. And there's a reason for doing that, because if you're aiming for code coverage, quite often your big methods call your smaller methods. And if your small methods have branches in them, if statements, well, covering that from a large method requires too many different permutations to get all the decisions made within a smaller method. So you're better off starting with small methods first, and then you'll find that your big methods, a test case for them, are a lot simpler, and you'll achieve coverage faster that way. Are you guys following me on that?
So I have a question on this. Typically,
Actually, okay, yes and no. I have some comments, but yeah, I did understood what you said. But, yeah, I mean, definitely. But then, of course, if you cover it from the down, of course, that's the best coverage. But it's just what it takes the most time to. Right? I mean, you have to.
It's going to take a lot more time to start from the large method if you want to cover all the small methods that it calls and the
Not if you
decisions.
go in the large method to all the permutation have the code.
Yeah, but that's a lot of code when you could just write a bunch of small test cases for the small code and then you might find that the happy path on the large test case everything's already covered below it, so you don't need to worry about it. Trust me.
Yeah, I totally, you're basically talking about functional decomposition and separating your more conditional logic from, like, that's your deciding versus your doing, right? But although I find that it's that conditional logic where the bugs pop up more often than some of the doing.
Well, I'm not talking about separating that.
Oh.
But that is part of the reason as well. I'm just saying that that quite often large methods are composed of smaller methods, and to cover all the small methods, there's going to be logic usually written around whether I'm going to call the small method or not, and stubbing the data in a manner that'll make sure that those small methods are called and covered within internally is much more complex than writing the test case for the small methods first.
My experience. I mean, absolutely, you're right in terms of, I mean, if you want to take a correct approach, but I think to it, basically, if our code coverage is less than 85%, basically, we can't even push into.
You don't start with the large methods first. You're going to go crazy doing that.
But in terms of I had actually cases where really I started actually from the large method and I had a shortcut. I mean, because again, there in that environment, if the code coverage is even 84%, you cannot even pass the test. So you have to have at least 85% to pass.
Well, you start small, and that allows you to cover more easily.
Yes, you're right. But I had cases where I really had good success with big methods too.
Okay. Well, you're really special.
I'm not sure.
One question I want to ask is, what you were speaking previously was big methods, break them into smaller chunks, right? So
Right.
the other smaller methods. So also you were saying to make them package visibility so that technically, because I have my.
Well, only if you need only.
So do my smaller methods are then always private? I can test private methods?
You can if you want to. There are certain times when you're sharing your code with other companies and you want to hide the implementation, and you don't want them to mess around with your system, so it makes sense to make things private.
Right.
In that situation, yeah, you would make it private and you can still test it.
But from my best practice, if I'm breaking my methods into smaller chunks, default I can go with package then, or because it's been driven to me like.
It depends.
Maybe right.
No, because you see, obviously, if your method is private, even if you have the testing in the same package, you still cannot see the method, and that makes it testing harder.
No, that's kind of what I'm trying to get into. So if I'm breaking into small chunks, they cannot be private then to make it easy to test.
They can be.
Okay.
They can be.
Well,
But it all depends on, I guess, the security requirements of the code you're writing. And I don't know if security is the right term, but if you make things package friendly, people can hack it more easily.
Okay.
They can still hack it if it's
Maybe
private.
we take advantage of something to get around it. I think in Groovy it's public by default instead of
Oh, really?
package. Yeah. I think so.
Wow.
I think so.
Right, I'll continue down my list. Wait, did I answer?
And just to ask, so the other challenge is when I'm breaking the smaller chunks, then I have to work, every time I'm testing these smaller chunks, I have to worry about preparing and setting up the state, right? Every
Correct.
time. Okay.
Oh,
That seems like a lot more.
that's another thing I should have wrote about writing testable software is favor parameters for your methods over shared mutable data that is on some field.
I mean, in C++ is a good solution. Basically, you can make a class a friend of another class, and then so these issues are gone. But in Java, there's no friend concept. In C++, you make it easy by making it a friend.
Okay, so I do suggest, and I highly encourage you to write test cases in the same package as the class being tested. It'll make your software easier to test because you'll have access to the package-friendly things if they are made visible in that manner. I don't know why I wrote mention code coverage, but I should have said use code coverage. That's a typo in my test. And this is more or less one of my pet peeves. But I highly encourage people to make each unit test to be completely independent of other unit tests. It's not production code where you're supposed to be using constants and shared variables. Because when you have all the constants, you usually have a lot of test cases, right? A test class ends up pretty big because it has to cover all these different permutations of the logic in the code. If you want to, I mean, a lot of permutations of the logic in the code to achieve high coverage. And for that reason, quite often, a test class is a lot bigger than the code that you're testing. And if you decide to make every parameter in there some sort of constant, because somebody told you shouldn't have these magic variables in the code, what ends up happening is all your constants end up usually on the top of the code, right? And you're reading code over here, and you're like going back and forth trying to find out, the next day, 2 days later, trying to find out what the code is doing in that unit test. And you're pecking all over the place to find out.
You're saying you're trying to find, so you do like a static final up at top, and you're trying to find the value of that while you're reading the code.
Yes.
But doesn't your IDE, when you hover over, just explain what it is?
That's in debugging, yes.
Huh?
When you're debugging it, it does.
Oh.
But
Yeah.
when you're not debugging it, it's not going to tell you the value. And at least in my ID, maybe your ID is better than mine.
I don't know. I'm using IntelliJ, but
So do I. Well, let's look at it. I have an example here of bad. Oh God, what is this?
Yeah, I definitely made an assumption here. I don't know if there was.
Here's an example of bad code. Okay. Well, I consider it bad. So, does it tell me the value?
No, it doesn't.
It doesn't. Where?
No.
But when you're debugging it, it'll tell you the value.
Yeah, well, yeah, even in IntelliJ, for some reason, it seems worse than.
I don't think Eclipse does it either.
No, it doesn't.
No, I'm just saying with some of the hover overs, even in debug mode, it's not.
Control J on it?
Yeah.
Control J is like a Java doc.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Control B will give you the declaration. Control Q should give you the docs, right?
No. So
Yeah, Control J is actually the docs, but it happens to have the value there, coincidentally.
Let me ask this. So what is now the solution? You mean that you don't create constants? What do you do then? If you don't create
Well, it should be more like this, where you have the variables in there, and you know what they are, rather than having to always look up and then make the data, make all the test cases depend on that value, and
Okay.
it makes it.
So basically,
when-
absolutely. I mean, of course.
I know you're copying and pasting, but
No,
it
no.
makes the test cases a lot more easier to maintain in the long run.
No. Look, of course, I mean, the general rule is that the visibility of the variable should be as localized as possible. And of course, this is a better localized variable than something you.
Yeah, but then somebody says, "Hey, these happen to be the same value. Why shouldn't it be a constant?" People will say that.
Sonar company.
Huh?
Basically,
Sonar.
No,
Yeah, I mean, you are violating try.
No. If you can, visibility of a variable overrides everything else. I mean, if you can keep the variable in terms of visibility more localized, that's what you're going to
Well, we agree on that, but a lot of people don't write test cases that way.
Then they don't really understand.
And when I'm writing the test cases, it's driving me crazy because I have to take just because you didn't write the test case, right?
No,
And you didn't write the test.
Absolutely, if you need a variable just here, it's absolutely.
Bazad, we're agreeing on the same thing. But what I'm saying is, if you didn't do it that way, and you have to go to the when and look if the value is equal, like right here, when this value was thrown in there and when you're verifying it, you know what the values are. It's hard to compute the expected values. You're going up and down all the time.
I'm just saying, if you can have a variable here and you define the top, that's absolutely wrong. I mean, the top variables are.
You're agreeing with me.
Oh, yeah.
So why are you acting like you're disagreeing?
I'm just saying this is obvious. If you can.
No, but it's not obvious because you. I mean, you guys see that. This is okay.
I'm excited about dry. Dry is important to me.
What is that?
Dry.
Yeah.
The dry.
Do not repeat yourself.
Yeah, don't repeat yourself.
Okay.
No, because especially when you say this makes maintenance easier, my thing about dry is like, well, dry makes maintenance easier because you change it in one place. When you copy and paste, or you have duplicated code, you have to go
That
through and
is
make
not
sure you get it.
really dry. I mean, of course.
This is supposed to be autonomous. Each test case. That's why. So that's why dry doesn't apply here.
I don't believe this.
It's conflicting principles.
This is not production code. This is test code. It's different principles. You're not
And
gonna.
I'm just saying that's one principle, dry is another principle.
I don't believe this.
Yeah, those principles conflict. I agree that they conflict, and I wouldn't suggest using dry for test cases.
Is dependency injection related to what you guys are talking about?
No, not at all. This is no, it's not related at all. All right, let me proceed with the presentation. This number 6 is my opinion, because when I have to go to other people's codes and change it and then use the unit test as a regression test, and then you need to fix the unit test, and then I go there and I'm like, oh man, I don't know what this is doing because the value is way up there. And then I need to inline the code, and so it's easier for me to read, and then I ended up changing the whole thing so that it's more like mine. Now that's kind of rude, right? Some people think it's unethical to change other people's ideas, but I don't know why they find it easier. I don't. All right. Introducing Mockito and PowerMock. With these mocking frameworks, they allow you to mock, stub, verify, match arguments, check the order, verify things, check the number of calls that this method that were performed on the method, throw exceptions, spy on values, count your arguments, even call the real methods. With PowerMock, you could mock final, private, and static variables. Static methods, I should say. Something you cannot do with Mockito alone. And I didn't put it in there, but you could also mock new instances of classes with PowerMock. So just so you understand the meaning of mock, stub, match, and verify, because not everybody does. When we mock an object, we create a reference to it that is not real. The reference is real, but it's not the real object in its implementation anymore. Because you get the control through stubbing what its return values will be when it is passed specific parameters if you're going to use matching. Or you could say any parameter, but you get to control what its return values are going to be on a mocked object. And finally, once you actually utilize, you make a certain call and your mocked object is called, you're able to verify that the method was called with the parameters that you expected. That's what these mocking frameworks provide to you in unit testing that we didn't have 14 years ago. And it allows you to easily write test cases that don't have to call the integration points anymore, because you're able to mock them and stub them and match that the parameters that you expect are called and verify them. Now, I'm kind of curious, who here has written unit tests with JUnit? I'm assuming everybody. Yeah, everybody. How about, has everybody here also used a mocking framework? Just 2 out of the 4. So that means that this presentation will be useful for you guys. That's great. So here's a basic mock verify recipe. You have an account service. You're mocking it. And you have an ATM that uses an account service. You calculated an expected balance of, well, these are pennies, right? So that'll be $9,999. An account number that I just wrote, 76568. God, it's so noisy here. An actual balance. So this account service is mocked, and we tell it, within the test case, we say, when the withdraw method is called in the account service with these parameters, account number equal to 76568, and the second parameter equal to 100, which would be an amount, then return 9999900. Then we have a try finally block with the try block doing the actual ATM withdrawal. And we verify that the withdrawal happened on the account service with these parameters. If these parameters equal account number 100 or equal 100, if those parameters are not called on the account service withdrawal method, the test case will fail. It's all, hey, it wasn't called. If it was called twice, it'll even fail, because I didn't tell it. By default, in Mockito and PowerMock, if you do a verify method, it's only going to expect the invocation 1 time. But you could actually put a comma here and tell it how many times to expect the call for that mocked object, or even a minimum number of times, or you could even tell it, this method is not called, never called, don't expect it. And finally, you assert it. So we could assume that this account service would be TCP IP call to some, I don't know, centralized ATM system. But our test case is mocking that actual call by writing a gateway called the account service and mocking it in our test case.
Is Mockito or PowerMock, or is it same for both?
It's the same for both, actually.
Oh.
I'm confused here. You see, because aren't you supposed to not interact with the external entity?
They're not. It's mocked.
But ATM that do their ATM is an actual. Oh, it's using the mark. I see.
Yeah.
Yes. Sorry.
It's okay. I mean, I just thought people would understand this example. Right?
And
Is somewhere else what do you call it? When you call mock on there, is there another method somewhere that's filling that in and creating whatever values?
Okay, can you repeat the question?
I'm just trying to understand in the first line where you're calling mock with.
You don't have a full view of it, but that's actually a static method that's imported usually. That is creating a CGDubbed object, but used by the mocking framework.
basically, you have to distinguish 2 phases: teaching phase and using phase. The line where it says when is the teaching phase.
Okay.
And other frameworks like EasyMock, you have to say basically end the teaching phase with the command, like a replay or something that says, okay, now your teaching phase is ended, now you're going to start using it. Here in Mockito, there is no explicit command. When you start using the objects, it automatically knows to end the teaching phase. So basically, you really are at the teaching phase when you say when, and when you start exercising it, when you say ATM.withdraw, you are at that point, it is starting to exercise the object.
Basically programming.
Yeah, it is usually in this order. You mock, then you stub. That's usually what the when parts are. Then you verify.
So basically, you go
So
to-
usually you say 3 sections of code doing that, and that's why I tried to group them in the code as well.
So basically, the first line, it actually to the basic reflection, it takes all the methods out of that class and it knows about those methods. Then you come and start teaching it. Okay, when this method is called, with this one, you're going to return this line. And then you go to the exercise case when you say ATM.VDR.
We're gonna take a 10-minute break right now. Is that okay? Because I don't know, I think it's been about an hour, so. I'll put a timer.
If you want,
Set a timer for 10 minutes.
if you want, it looks like you might fill up the 2 hours, I don't know. But if you don't, I just finished a tutorial on my website on Jenkins for use with Java, and we can go through it in like 10 minutes because it's visual, right? This is what Jenkins out, but this is the tool we use.
Maybe,
Yeah, that's what I meant.
I want this to be a 10-minute. I want this to be.
No, I meant at the end, if there's time.
If there's time, sure. Although I have a pretty hard deadline to do this. My daughter is in the.
Yeah, when I meant 10 minutes, I meant 10 minutes.
Why don't we just use yours and then to go more elaborated maybe in the next session, because that's definitely useful too.
It doesn't take, I couldn't stretch it to be very long.
I'm surprised this stretched out for this long, actually.
Yeah.
No, this is a too important part. It's serious. It's serious.
Well, I would do just an addendum.
I was getting nervous.
With some pretty pictures.
Well, if you're thinking of doing it next time, maybe you could add something to it.
You know, I always thought that we could have a lot of important topics that are not necessarily worth a 2-hour presentation, but say, hey, we'll give you 30 minutes.
If you had 4 presentations, yeah.
I always thought that would be a good idea.
I did too. I asked some people if they would do this, and
Getting people to do it is the hard part.
yeah. Well, the funny part was people came back and they said the truth is that it's harder to shrink the topic
Yeah.
down to 20 minutes or a half hour than it is to fill up the 90 minutes.
Because
We usually have a 90-minute topic.
usually, it depends on the topic.
Yeah.
Some topics are.
Yeah, I gave a talk on talent once, and yeah, I think with all the questions, it went 2 hours.
Yeah.
Even though
Some topics really good, yeah, we don't talk about. Some topics, yeah, of course.
What really surprised me in this was that you can actually find the methods and final methods.
You can implement final, is what you're saying?
You could mock methods that are final. I mean, you can sub methods that are final.
Because of reflection and the CG lib is,
There's,
I mean, when you said that, the first thing I thought was Hibernate. Hibernate has that field level where you can, you have private fields and there's no getters or setters, but it finds a way to set them.
So the reflection, unfortunately, is the background in Java, so through reflection, you know that thing.
Yeah,
Well,
it's a reflection of the big backdoor.
the big background, that's.
But yeah, I mean, it's for frameworks mostly.
People use it.
Do you guys use reflection much?
I use it. I use it.
I use it
A lot.
It's usually, that's supposed to.
Well, here's a better question. Are you guys building framework level type?
Well, the thing is, no, you don't need to. I'm not.
Oh,
But the thing is, I learned a new feature in Java recently, and recently means like within the past 4 months, that I think will allow me to get rid of the reflection in my code. I forget the exact term, but I remember the initials, SPI, service something interface.
service provider interface?
Yes.
Exactly. So basically, that's what I was gonna say. 90% of the time, what you could do with reflection is definitely connect. I've seen lots of Fabrizio, that's a role transfer. in reflection code, and I saw it, and I told him, "Look, you have to write reflection code." He didn't like it, but
But they didn't have this service provider interface.
no, but even normal interfaces can definitely.
Well, the reason I was using it is because I had multiple implementations of something that I didn't know which one was going to be used. I would start an application, and a command line parameter would say, use this type of this interface. And it very well could be that that particular implementation isn't available in the class path, because I was thinking that particular module is an add-on that the person who uses it is going to buy. You can't just get it for free. So I was using Reflection to load it. But now that I've experienced what's called the service provider interface, I could probably use that instead of Reflection. And it uses Reflection underneath the hood, I'm quite sure.
Yeah.
But
Honestly, I mean, the dynamic loading, I use the bridge pattern and the constructor, basically parameterless constructors. With these two combinations, you can dynamically load code in Java. You use the bridge pattern, and if a constructor doesn't have parameter and your class that provides those type of constructors, you could definitely load dynamically. And that I used long time ago, like back in, I guess, 2001, 2002. In a reflection, most of the time when I see a reflection code, I definitely can see that I can replace dots of it with interface-based programming. That's what I see a lot, actually, that people use the reflection because it's easy, it's powerful, I mean, they
use Reflection. When I have used Reflection, almost every time it's been in that when I'm providing, in the same use case that I use the service provider interface, the same exact one. Like, I don't know if the library is going to be there or not, but I want to grab this implementation of something if it is there. Because the library might not be there, it's going to be a class not found exception. So I need to introspect the class path and find out if these certain libraries are here. If they are, then load it and use that feature. If not, then don't. That's one I'm using. And I think that is a proper use case for it, but there might be easier ways around it now. When did service provider interface get exposed? You know, was it JP 1.7?
No idea.
I think it was 1.7. It's a pretty new feature, and I think a lot of developers still know about it.
I've never heard of it.
I use them, so.
No, I use it at work right now.
Yeah, well, I'm working like 99% grooving, so it has its own almost built-in type of reflection.
So what is service provider interface?
You could have different libraries, jar files, that implement an interface for you. It allows the, I'll say, main or root application that's going to use those to determine which of those instances it's going to be loaded in the actual runtime of an application. Without you having to explicitly state which one.
So it picks which jar file to load or which?
Yeah. But you do have a little bit of control as to which.
The class loader, you would use a class loader for that, right?
No. You use a service provider interface. You gotta
It's like,
say
is it training, it's training on like OSGI or?
no, it's not.
No.
Because the class.
Because what you have to do is you have to add a file in the meta directory of your jar that says you implement this interface in this class, and it looks in those meta files for those text files, and then it reads them and then instantiates them like that. That's what it does. I think you have to be constructed as
Exactly. You have to-
Yeah. That's-
Oh, okay.
And so it saves you the trouble of using reflections and things like that. And then it iterates to each instance it finds. Your code controls which instance to return. Quite often, the first one that it finds is going to be the one that it returns for the implementation. But you could actually control, say, hey, if I have all these systems up here, please load this one first. Or you could even add a method in there that prior.
How do you say which is it jar name or?
No, you don't control the jar. You just
In this method, data file, I need to provide your class name.
Yeah, how do you define the implementation in that metadata?
code.
Oh, okay. But you just specify the package name.
I mean, you might put a string in it to identify yourself.
Okay, so this isn't necessarily solving the problem of identical package names and like the multiple jar issue.
No, it doesn't solve.
It
It's just
allows
the
you-
implementation of an interface, that's it.
Essentially, no, it doesn't. Yeah, it doesn't solve that. I wish it would have solved it.
Yeah, that's, yeah.
All right.
OSGI.
Actually, does it actually solve the?
Okay, we're going to continue. Sorry. We waited 10 minutes. So. Now, introducing PowerMock. PowerMock comes in handy where Mockito falls short. It allows you to stop final methods, static methods, and even mock the construction of new objects. I think that's a very powerful feature in unit testing that we definitely did that 14 years ago, or at least an easy way of doing it 14 years ago. That, again, allows you to test your integration points and even the private method calls in there.
So is it a superset of Mockito or is it a kind of
So it supplements it.
supplement?
Is it complementing it? I don't know. Maybe those words are interchangeable here.
If you use PowerMock, are you gonna still be needing Mockito or?
You don't need to, but you can. They work well together.
But you don't need to, then it's a superset. I guess.
Yeah.
Do you have an example of the last one? Mock construction of the objects?
No, but I can show one to you.
Yeah.
But I don't have one. I didn't have it in my code because I find it. I think it's such a weird use case.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't understand too.
What would you wanna do this even? Or I don't understand.
No, I mean, I don't understand what exactly you mean mocking construction.
Well, you might have let's say you have a private method that you know is gonna make a new instance of something, but you need to control how that new instance inside that private method works.
Oh,
And so you can mock that new instance that's going to be instantiated in that private method. And it'll now behave the way you want it to. That's one way. That's one particular use case. But you could also just have the private method and
right.
I don't know, but maybe you're doing white box testing of that private method and how it behaves internally, right?
Okay.
So that's a scenario. But I mean, I skipped a lot of code in this snippet, but here is a snippet of code that tells you how to mock a private method. First of all, with the test case, you gotta state that you're running with a PowerMock runner. Now, the class that has your private method, you have to prepare for the test with that annotation as well. Prepare for test. Now, there's a lot of mock code and so forth missing in this example, which I already said. But here you mock your private method, but with PowerMock instead of Mockito. I could have statically imported this, but I made it an explicit.
What's that prepare thing doing? What's that?
It's I don't know exactly what it does, but if you are going to use certain features in PowerMock that are very unique features, such as the ability to mock a static, private, or final method, then you need to include that annotation for that particular class that has that
I guess without that annotation,
It won't work.
PowerMark would be at the level of Mockito, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a fair way of saying it. So then when you're stubbing your mocked method, here, hi. Here you say, it's like Mockito, you're saying when this mock object is called, but instead of having the parentheses, dot, and then the method call, you're stating what which private method is called, which is retrieve balance. And then you're listing the parameters. Right here, you could add more parameters. This one's just account ID. And you're gonna say the private method returns this current balance. And finally, at the end, if you want to verify that the private method is called, use Power Mockito verify private. But instead of having the method call here, you say invoke, and then the name of the private method, and then the parameters that were called. And that's how you verify that the private method was called. Now this is if you use if you use Mockito, you didn't see this before, right?
Right.
And that's pretty cool. Not that hard, huh? So you don't need to make package friendly if you don't want to, if you use PowerMock.
Right.
But it is definitely a little more code. So, and maybe people are like afraid of using PowerMock, so they would rather just use package friendly test. All right, so now I'm gonna go on to, before I start writing code, if I do write code, I'm gonna tell you the topics that that are sort of complementary to unit testing in general. One thing I do when I write unit test is I use code coverage. I usually don't use Corbatura for that. I usually just tell my IDE to cover it for me and it'll generate a report and I can see what happened. And that's fast enough. But if I want to see what the code coverage is, because I can actually control at a method level. If I want to see what the code coverage is throughout the whole project, you don't even need to set up your Maven plugins in the POM. You just write Maven clean Corbatura. It'll run your test cases and instrument them and generate a code coverage report for you if you do that.
No, I don't know.
Yeah,
So Maven does it for you then.
Maven does it for you.
What's this code two? What's the?
It's a code coverage tool,
I see.
Is that the commercial one or the open source one?
open source.
Yeah, I've actually looked at these code coverage tools recently, and the reason we went with Jacopo was a follow-on to Emma, was that the code did not have to be instrumented. Somehow it could connect to the JVM to get this code coverage data. So it's kind of interesting that the older way is that you have to instrument the code, so that runtime and any profiling will change because your code's not going to be as quick as it's been instrumented. While with Jacopo, it will not instrument, but it uses some working with the JVM to get this data.
Let's figure out how to spell it. So example, Maven clean Corbatura. I run it. It's running it right now. Then I open and it's a bit site. And there's a report right there.
Yes.
It tells you the coverage. This one's not very well covered, is it? 18%? Yeah. So my code isn't very well covered except for this. That's a bit of it. The part that's green, that part's covered. So I would say that my samples that I have in my presentation. We don't have a lot of code coverage. Oh man, where was I? Oh, it brought me back. So adding Cobertura, using Cobertura is really easy. But quite often what I do is I just, let me get my unit test. Oh man, I can't see. Usually what I end up doing is I just go here, run with coverage instead of using Cobertura and IntelliJ. So it runs it, and then over here, I tell it, generate a report for me, open up in the browser. And it's almost the same thing. It's a little different.
Maybe one was easy too. I mean, just.
Yeah, but the thing is, this one you could actually control which method to call,
Yeah.
or which classes, whereas the Maven one is going to
Run it.
everything. And I think if your test cases halt, or sometimes test cases take a long time, so I usually just use IDE. Yeah, just on the run the coverage feature. That's how I usually do it. Now, my IDE quite often will highlight things and tell me when there's a statically found bug in there, but if you're curious what the results are without using them, without configuring everything, it's really not that hard. I think in my TM, I introduced a bug right here. See this method, a bug? You know what'll happen if I call it, right? The null pointer exception. Well, find bugs. Find that for you. Ah,
So yeah.
Maybe click the platform.
Intelligent.
no. This is a Maven command. So if you just want to quickly statically check your code without writing a unit test, this could save you some time from writing the unit test. Failure. Why did it fail? Well, there's two reasons why. You're calling to a string on a string, and it says that's dumb. Another one, well, it gives you three reasons why. The other one is all from the same method. The other one is you're loading a null value. Another one is the return value of the string is ignored. Sorry, how many bugs? It says 4 bugs.
Yes. You got this.
Null pointed, but null pointed reference is the biggest one.
Just in one line, that's 4 bucks. That's it. Why intensity? One code.
No, it's one method. It's not one line.
But essentially,
I'll show you again.
okay, one that method, you just have 2 lines.
Yeah. So
That's funny.
So I didn't do any special Maven magic for that. I just ran find bugs. But if you want to make it part of your build, some people find value in that. And usually it will be done in the verify stage of Maven, which is it's after test. When you do an install, the verification is run.
Because you see, Eclipse has a plugin called Findbox. So yeah, I'm using it. And it's really nice. I mean, it finds lots of bugs as I write code.
It's the same plugin.
It's the same plugin.
Yeah. But you could put in your build. by adding, well, you should manage the plugin. That's part one of the recipe. Then you have to add it, the Find Bugs Maven plugin, telling it to run with these effort max, threshold low, output, XML true, the goal check. And then when you do Maven Clean Verify or Maven Clean Install, it'll automatically invoke Find Bugs for you. And other related tools that come in handy in the world of unit testing or testing in general, of course, are continuous integration. Jenkins is quite popular for that. And usually just what Jenkins will do is it'll check out your application every time there's a commit to the project. And then it'll usually run an install to check if there's compile errors and subsequently run the unit tests that are in there. And then when it fails, you get to make fun of or point or blame the person who made the error. Two other tools that are quite popular in testing in general are code reviews. Garrett is open source. It's pretty nice. I don't know if anybody here has used it. And Crucible is nicer, but costs money. And another thing that I don't see many companies use it actually, but it looks cool, but I never find it that practically useful. Is Sonar. Are all of you familiar with Sonar?
We actually use it.
But do you really use it or just go like,
Yeah.
oh, wow, that's right?
So the thing is, all the code coverage, the find bug reports, everything, and I mean that's pretty much what we're using Sonar for. So like, yeah, run the build, and we'll see on the UI.
It
So
seems like Sonar's like just a top level sort of integration tool.
What does it do?
it's reporting. It's your.
It's just code metric measure, automated code metrics.
Okay.
It executes actually a lot of these other tools.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's what I meant by like a top level, because that's what I'm seeing so many things where it's like, oh, this as a plugin for Sonar.
Exactly.
A lot of tools are compliant with it. You run buttons, but.
Now, let's see. I can try to write test cases in front of you guys if you're curious, if you're that curious. So,
One question I have on code coverage is, you mentioned you try to keep your code coverage to 100%, but like I find
I don't try to, but
100%? No, 100% is hard.
yeah.
I mean, it's hard. So, see, as an example, like we use a lot of the data transfer objects, like dummy objects, and my reports complain that I don't cover that as part of my test. So, do you actively write tests for that kind of objects?
Sometimes,
Okay.
because sometimes
Because literally, I'm writing.
I find bugs in there.
What you have? No, I'm talking about like dummy DTOs.
What do you mean in dummy DT?
So it's just purely get a set of an object where I'm simply trying to set values and get values and pass it around.
No, nothing like that. Actually, where I do find bugs is not necessarily that. It's in my company, we use data transfers object quite often, but we also use another type of service called a transformer, which converts it to another type of object.
Okay.
Usually you're interacting with different layers which have their own version of the same code, but you need to transform it. And quite often those transformers have bugs. And that's where I find issues most of the time.
Okay.
When I'm testing the transformers, the DTOs get covered at that stage. Just by the fact that I'm instantiating them and assigning values and getting them in the transformer. So I don't explicitly aim to test the DTO, but when I'm unit testing the transformer, it gets tested. Make sense?
Yeah.
So for DTO, yeah, you don't have to write unit tests for them, but in the services I use them, they will be covered. Right?
Is he gonna mock them now? Are you, or don't you mock out at the DA level, later? Is that what you're doing?
No, I'm not saying it'd be a DTO.
Yeah. Oh. Okay.
In my view, I think unit testing is a balancing act. I mean, you could really get into it, and at the end, the question is overhead that you're paying is going to pay off. I mean, because any change in the code means now you're going to change your unit tests. In my view, it's a balancing act. If people try to cover 100% or even 90%, sometimes in my view, they pay too much. They might be paying too much.
And do you have experience like trying to test for like a callback method on the object, or is it?
For a callback method?
Yeah. So I have a class that pretty much uses service. Well, at that point we make integration, but if I have a task that is trying to execute something and there's a callback on the result, and I'm going to test for that result.
I don't remember ever doing that, but
Okay.
let me go over my example then.
Is this the callback has an environment that needs to be set up?
Typically, the callback. Well, in my specific example, the callback is just.
So what you can do, the callback method, is you could give it a parameter of any, and then if it's a void, I don't know what the callback method does, but the parameter of any, and then if it has a return, tell it to return something.
So my problem here is the callback method is my object is part of the object under test.
Is your callback?
But you're not responsible for the callback. Callback is the interested call.
Right.
That should not be part of the test.
Okay.
Should certainly not be part of the test. That definitely is not a unit test. You're going too far.
I mean, I think that's what I mean. Yes, but I need to. I guess then at that point my test becomes an integration test.
Yes.
So I just need to figure out how to.
So let me go over my fictitious example, my fake example, my trivial example. I have an account service which creates accounts with an initial balance. It withdraws an amount from that account, deposits an amount from that account, and it checks the balance. Now, all of these methods, the return method is the new balance afterwards, with an exception of check balance, which is going to be the current balance. And usually in ATM, you have to log in with a PIN. I just call it authenticate. The account ID, you have the PIN, retrieve the PIN, assign the PIN. And I have an ATM, which, let me get rid of this bug. Which uses the authentication service and the account service. There's a constructor there assigning them. And when you use ATM, you could withdraw it with your account, your PIN, and withdraw a certain amount from it. But if you gave it an invalid PIN, well, it'll throw an exception for you. When you withdraw and you don't have sufficient funds if you don't have sufficient funds, it'll throw an exception as well. When you deposit, there will never be an exception, but unless you gave it a bad PIN. Same thing for check balance.
These things are throwing a runtime exception because they're not declared. So you withdraw it.
Yeah, they're runtime exceptions. Now, one thing that I did interesting that threw a wrench in this, an intentional wrench, is that I made the withdraw method final just to show that I have to use Mockito with this. PowerMock. Another one, I made a private method in there that returns a value that has to be used. So let's see, how would I test this? Well, I already have some good and bad versions of it, but let me do it from scratch. And then I'll start off with test cases. I'm not used to this resolution. I always see the menu item to the right, but with this resolution, it's on the left. Notice, well, look at ATM test. Notice that they're in the same package. That's by design. I do that because maybe I'm going to expose some things package friendly to share with my test cases. In this particular implementation, I don't need to do that, but it's still a good practice to put your classes in the same package as the classes that are tested, because you never know when you're going to do that. A lot of people, they will make a separate test package. It drives me crazy.
Doesn't make sense.
Doesn't make sense,
Does not.
but they do it anyways because they don't make sense. And there's smart people, but that doesn't mean they make sense. So let me try to test this. I'll use.
So this is what not to do because it's like a separate package, right?
No, this is how to do it. They're in the same package.
So it's a question.
Oh,
Here's-
It's a black box testing. If this is a black box testing, you kind of have to expose as much as possible. And that's the point.
So here's a test directory and the production directory, and they're in the same package, if you notice.
okay, I was looking at the package reference at the top of your file.
It's the same package.
Oh, the whole. Oh, the service is also under unit test. Okay, I'm looking for package. I would think the unit test.
Because the presentation's about unit tests. Sorry about that. Yeah, I should have thought about that earlier, but I didn't. So I'm going to test the withdraw. Remember, it's final. So let's mock account service implementation.class. I'm going to pull in Mockito first so we can see it fail. So there I created an ATM with those mocked services there. I'm going to withdraw $100. And I want to say that let's say I had $1,000, okay? So I'm just going to run this without stopping anything. at this point, just to see what happens. We're gonna see problems, probably, there's gonna probably be a null pointer exception, right?
Because you didn't teach it.
Yeah, I didn't teach it. Invalid ping. That makes sense, because they called authentication service with a value and they returned null because it wasn't taught. But in real life, you would be looking at the code. You'd actually go into authentication service and say, oh, I'm expecting the authenticate call. So I would say when authenticate service, authenticate, and then the pin is 456. And return true. So yeah, they're valid. First it does that, and then there's the withdraw method. So when account service withdraw 123L 100L oops, it should be so I'm saying when the account service is called with these values, return 900. Now, typically, you would use matchers when you're writing these test cases. By default, it is an equals matcher, but sometimes, quite often, you don't have control as to what value is going to actually be in there. So you might need to use an any matcher. You don't know if it's R. When you go to the documentation through Mockito, it'll elaborate on that for you.
So EQ is a function provided by Marquis.
Yeah.
I think it's Hamcrest, actually.
What?
A technology called Hamcrest.
Ham?
Yeah.
Rest.
Yes, exactly. Why it's called that, I don't know, but so it's going to check that the value is actually equal to that value when it's called. Now this is going to fail. Do you guys know why? No.
Where did you say the initial balance is 1,000, but when you now withdraw?
The initial balance is
1,000.
1,000. That because when you withdraw 100, that's why your current balance is going to be 900 afterwards. But I didn't specify the initial balance. So this is going to fail for one reason. It turns out that the withdraw method is final. But let's run it and see what happens. Null pointer, retrieve balance, 954. What did I do wrong? Wait a minute. Now that's interesting.
What did you say?
No, what's interesting to me is I have an ATM withdrawal with 123L. That's the account ID. That's the PIN, and that's the amount to withdraw. And where it failed, I didn't expect that actually. Let me try that again. Just so I can know where it failed. Oh, account service. There's two reasons why it failed. The first reason why it failed is because it calls a private method here, which I have no control over. So this code is harder to unit test because of that. The second, but it's perfectly legit. You know, you want to not repeat yourself.
So basically, because the withdrawal is calling the retrieve balance,
Right.
it cannot go that deep because it doesn't.
Correct. And the other thing is that it's final. So in this particular test case, we have to use Mockito.
Power.
Power mock, I mean. So let me see what the code looked like for that earlier. Run with power mock runner lost. And the one that's giving us trouble is account service implementation. So now if I run it,
So you have to keep the input.
I just want to see what happens. Sorry. I know it's not going to run, but annotation must be a class literal. Parentheses. No pointer because I didn't stub it. So let's stub that. To specify the method. Retrieve balance, is that the method that's there?
No, you should say withdraw. Withdraw is the one that.
No, I have to mock the private method.
Oh,
And then the argument there would be the count ID. That should be your up with equal. I know I could have copied with the bug, but I didn't do that. Now, for some reason, I don't like that they did this. It will throw an exception. So, it's returning you the initial balance of 1,000. That's what I was talking about earlier. And then one thing I could do, since that part is actually mocked now, it is actually returning the balance. And when you're doing withdraw, it's doing that call. I could actually have it call the real method here. I don't really need to mock it anymore because I see what it's doing. You guys get that? Then you go back to the account service. I mocked this method to return 1,000.
sorry.
But previously I mocked withdraw. But it's not necessary anymore because I got the layer below it mocked. So I could actually say when this is called, a real method, another picture in there. I think this will pass.
What do you real method? Then call real method?
Even though the object is mocked, it has the ability to call the real implementation.
Oh, from the withdraw. I see.
From the account service. So if you look at account service, this method, this private method is mocked right now, right?
But the withdraw is very real. I see. Withdraw is very real. With
Yeah.
the mark, I see. Wow, that's cool.
Run the test with her. Oh, where did I?
I think it's not getting the stuff for trade balance.
Is your mock statements is going to tell it to generate a new class, right? You can't really choose.
Oh,
What's that?
I know what I did wrong. I have to use Power Mockito for that. Let me try it again.
What's called Power Mockito?
Wrong type of return value.
Power
Atomic
Mockito, is that different than Power Mock?
It's part of Power Mock. Where's my test case? Okay, here it's supposed to be a atomic log.
Sound like the word that words of monkey is.
Yay! Now let's say I was testing this and I wanted to say that an invalid was given inside, for some reason happened inside that illegal argument exception right here. I wanted to say that happened. So quite often I would copy the code. I'll just say with the counter count. I'll give it a meaningful name so that I know what the test case is covering. And then I'll say when retrieve balance is called, then what kind of argument exception? And over here, I'd expected. And so I will cover the situation when that has an error. But one thing you want to test quite often is when you run something, you also want to verify that the method call was even made. Usually it involves getting where everything was done, changing this to verify, adding the close parenthesis here. That's why you use the matchers, because you're verifying that it's actually called with that value. And quite a common bug that I've experienced is when I'm writing my verify, this parenthesis has to go here, right after the mocked object. Whereas when you're doing the when, the parenthesis is after the method call. So it gets really, the semantics are a little different, but it'll still compile. So if there's a return value, so see that? That's gonna fail because this parenthesis actually belongs here. So be careful. So I think this will still run with verifications. But let's say I wanted to say authenticate is called twice or 3 times. I could put the times there, even though it's not called that many times. It's gonna fail now because I'm saying that, hey, 1 or 3 times, but it was only called once. And I forget the syntax, but there's even ways to mock multiple invocations of the same parameters but different return values. Maybe it's time-based, for example.
Oh, I see.
Like,
It's
yeah, you're checking, is my account still valid? Well, the first time it is, but the second time it isn't.
It's like what you were saying earlier, the first part is teach, it's different, and the other part is execute. So
Syntax is a little different, but there's ways of doing that in here. And I've actually had to use that at times, where even though I'm calling it with the same, it's not a real function where the same value is going to always return. Now, how would you do the assertions here? Let's see. Over here, retrieve. Let's see which one. Actually, everything is called in it, so we do the same thing. Is there any particular use case? If I know the answer, I'll go over it really fast if you guys are interested to see, because this is the end of my codes on this. I show mocking private and final methods here, which is quite an advanced use case in my opinion, because the typical mocking frameworks don't allow for them.
I can show those Jenkins screenshots if you want.
You know what? I'm sorry, I have to pick up my daughter, so it's getting late. I have to say yes, but I'll try to see if I'll work that into the future.
It's just pertinent to this, that's why we brought it over. It's not a lecture.
So you could do one on
I don't know how it gets stretched out.
Well, there's gotta be a lot.
Hey, you know what? I didn't. I didn't expect this presentation to run this long, actually.
Yeah, because the question is long.
Now, what can I ask? I need to put myself on the spot. What did you guys think?
It was useful for me, but very useful.
You all learned something useful, right?
And mocking.
Now, I made the assumption that you guys all know this.
Well, I didn't know the power mark, I used the easy mark.
It's an assumption just for project knowledge. I could have.
But don't you see how this can make tests, right? Test cases a lot
A lot
easier for you?
Honestly, when I saw the power was first, I had to write some code that actually was robust against network errors. Marking is really the only way you can do this, because modern testing also case was when I had to test against databases that I didn't even have in my testing environment. Like production was SQL Server. I don't have SQL Server running in my test environment. So how am I supposed to test for?
All right, everybody. Thank you for attending LA Jug. I'm going to stop the broadcast now. Thank you. Bye.